What's up, Angels? Today we're going to be talking about sort of like a rant for me today. We're going to be talking about the New York band called Pyrexia. I didn't want to say New York death metal band to start with because to me, Pyrexia was always more so of a deathcore band, kind of like the hardcore death metal fusion of New York. I think of every single New York death metal band, I think Pyrexia was always the one that had the most hardcore elements in it. Contrary to what people would say for like Internal Bleeding with something like Onward to Mecca or Driven to Conquer. But to me, like, people I see a lot lately, and the reason why I'm making this video is I've seen a lot of people talk when talking about Pyrexia. They always mention Sermon of Mockery is like the only good Pyrexia. Like after Sermon of Mockery, like Pyrexia like sold out. Like that's their only death metal album, and it's like if you start off as a death metal band and you have one death metal album and then you release like 10 other deathcore releases, does that really mean that you were a death metal band compared to a deathcore band? What I'm pretty much trying to say is I think that Pyrexia is more notably a deathcore band than a death metal band for Sermon of Mockery. So like in saying that, a your example. So when talking about Pyrexia, so like System of the Animal, that was like one of the first true like deathcore albums out there for like '97. And their style has kind of been similar to that this entire time. I think that Sermon of Mockery was kind of like more so like a suffocation type of like 2.0 type of thing, whereas Pyrexia always wanted to do different stuff. And I don't think it's fair to keep on saying, Sermon of Mockery, Sermon of Mockery, Sermon of Mockery. Like, that was like 35 years ago. You know what I mean? It's if a band hasn't done something in 30, if the band hasn't done something like Sermon of Mockery for 35 years, why would why should that be like the only talking point, or like why would that make Pyrexia a death metal band that sold out and made deathcore? Wouldn't that mean that they're a deathcore band that has a death metal album? Like that's kind of like the main talking point. So for Pyrexia, it's kind of like they're a deathcore band that has a classic death metal album, as opposed to a death metal band that has really bad deathcore. Some would say, but like even for something like Internal Bleeding, like Voracious can like I discussed this in my Internal Bleeding reaction to the newest one on Megastomp, but it's like Voracious Content and Extinction of Benevolence were like 30 to like 28 years ago. You know what I mean? It's like those were like the last real like death metal. Like there was a little bit of like the Voracious on like corrupting influence, but there was still like that Driven to Conquer type of sound on it. You know what I mean? And it's like even for like something like Dehumanized, during like when they got back together, there was like breakdowns and like other like hardcore parts on the the one with the eyeballs, the orange one. I think it's like Behind the Mind or something, and like Controlled Elite. It just got me thinking like hardcore has kind of always been a part of New York death metal, and New York death metal has always kind of been a part of hardcore. And then you had like Traumacide in New York that was also like very deathcore. But it's like when I say deathcore, I don't mean like Whitechapel, Suicide, Silence, Job for a Cowboy, Waking the Cadaver. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that. But then it's like you also take into consideration like the early beatdown bands and stuff like Furia 5, Bulldozer, One Second Thought, Denied, which all had the very prevalent death metal sections. But it's kind of like you always kind of no matter how you point it, that hardcore and death metal, especially for New York, has always been kind of hand in hand. Uh, and even talking about like thrash and crossover at that time. Well, like before that time, like the 80s and early 90s with stuff like Leeway, like that was kind of like thrash metal and hardcore put together, and you had like Carnivore as well for that. It's kind of like, you'll see people always on from both sides being like, internal bleeding, always listen to hardcore, and then the death metal people are like, no, like F hardcore. But it's like, I kind of get that because they use that as an argument to try to defend like newer metalcore and deathcore and like post-hardcore. Like, they'll be like, hardcore doesn't suck because Chris Pervalis from Internal Bleeding said he was always listening to hardcore. That's why bands like Converge, Nails, and Full of Hell are like good. But it's like Internal Bleeding wasn't listening to MySpace hardcore and like Converge and stuff like that. Like Internal Bleeding was like most likely listening to stuff like Biohazard, Leeway, Agnostic Front, stuff like that. Like that was their hardcore, like Killing Time, Underdog, stuff like that. So it's like it's kind of like weird because in death metal we have all these subgenres like brutal death metal, we have symphonic death metal, blackened death metal, bestial black metal. Like, we have all these different phases of hardcore. You really don't have phrases like that. It all kind of gets lumped in, and I can understand the frustrations for that, especially because, like I mentioned, like, you try to defend older hardcore, like newer hardcore. Like, I've been really, like, there's this Beatdown band called No One Wins. Like, I was like really into that. Like, that's kind of, it sounded like a lot like Internal Bleeding, but like more Beatdown, but I don't know, this entire thing just got me thinking, like, when you try to defend hardcore, it just looks like it just looks like you're trying to make excuses for like more poser bands than like actual hardcore, because for me, like, I am the brutal death metal guy on YouTube, but I'm also not afraid to go into different heavy extreme genres that aren't just brutal death metal. Like, I've posted about the brutal hardcore bands that are coming out. I've regarded some of them highly, as I would other bands. And there is some like metallic hardcore that I'm into, but my main thing is the brutal death metal, the brutal death grind, slam, thrash metal. But it's just like, at what point do we cross the line and we say, okay, so like we have a band like Internal Bleeding, which has similarities to a band like Denied, which has similarities to like more like hard, like pure hardcore and like pure beatdown, and it's like we have all these kind of genres that all have the same, snare drum, all the same production, the same like loud vocals, but one band has just like a little bit more slam and death metal riffs, the other band just has a little bit more chug and slam and beatdown. But for that section of New York that I'm trying to like really talk about, it's like you can look at any New York death metal band's discography and it all kind of has at least a little bit of hardcore, and a lot of the hardcore also has a lot of death metal. Like, there is some death metal in Denied, there is some death metal in other stuff, but it's like you look at a band like a pure death metal band like Baphomet, and then it's like you look at Banished and you put the two side and side. It's like Banished had like total hardcore, like just the way his vocals were like more shouted, and the guitar is a lot more slower and heavier and more like bouncy. So, it's just something to think about. Hardcore has always kind of been in metal, and it's like you look at the lyrics of like Ripping Corpse with like Rift of Hate, and it's talking about how skinheads and metalheads should be united, because honestly, like even in like total like the new brutal death metal right now, like there's like this little civil war going on between like the hard brutal hardcore and brutal death metal. And like I mentioned, hardcore and death metal were always fighting, even like MySpace days of like the early 2000s. But it's like there's so much. We're both underground, we're both very autistic. Let's be honest. Like if you showed any of this to like a normal person, they're gonna be like, "This is fucking baby shit. Like this is stupid." But it's like for us, it just seemed. I guess it seems like the standard, because this is what we listen to. Like this is what we're used to. Like this is our scene. But we're supposed to be the outcasts. Like even in heavy metal and hardcore, like you look at the roots, like the 80s and the 90s, like we're all outcasts. Like this music wasn't meant for like the right, like the football stars of like your local high school. Like I guess like hardcore was like rec center jock music, but even still, it's like I don't know. It's I just feel like there's what I'm trying to say. Like I guess there's like more like stuff that we could be fighting together against, like really really bad like white belt skinny jean, like really bad deathcore, metalcore, like really bad trendy stuff. Even in like pure death metal, just like all the hipster bands, it's just like and it's like, damn, maybe Glenn Benton and J Dog were right. Like maybe we do have a problem with the scene of all the people in it. But I mean, for New York death metal, and especially bands like Pyrexia, it's like going back to Pyrexia. If you have 30 years of deathcore and one death metal album that was kind of like a Suffocation clone, like I think it's not so much as Sermon of Mockery was the only good thing they had. I think it's more so Sermon of Mockery was like an early like demo compared to their actual sound, which is their modern deathcore sound. And I've been re-listening to Pyrexia. Like I think that I always highly regarded the System of the Animal like Redux 25 like anniversary of that. Like that was really good. I reacted to that one like years ago. That's on my YouTube somewhere. But yeah, I enjoyed that one. But yeah, just some thoughts that I've been having. Just hardcore and New York death metal has been kind of like having like a little comeback lately. But those are just my thoughts. What do you think about New York death metal, Pyrexia, and hardcore? All three of them, talking the main talking points. Write in the comments all your opinion of hardcore, kids, hardcore and death metal and hardcore, deathcore, anything. I mean, if it's heavy, it's heavy. If it slams, it slams. If it growls, it growls. If it grunts, it grunts. If it shouts, it shouts. Is it heavy? Yes. Does it get me grooving? Yes. It's all that matters to me.